Where do we go from here? In many cases, men have been able to see the danger ahead of them, but they have surrendered to an idea that seduced them into an irrevocable disaster, by their own folly rather than their misfortune. Thucydides, Athenians to Melians, 416 BCE. We may have created a Frankenstein. Richard Nixon. According to the Washington script, this chapter should pivot to propose a new strategy for the United States in its rivalry with China, complete with a to-do list that promises peaceful and prosperous relations with Beijing. But an attempt to shoehorn this challenge into that template would demonstrate only one thing: failure to understand the essence of the dilemma this book has identified. What America needs most at this moment is not a new China strategy or what passes for strategy in Washington these days, but instead a serious pause for reflection. If the tectonic shift caused by China's rise poses a dilemma of genuinely Thucydidean proportions, then calls for a more robust or muscular pivot will amount to little more than taking an extra-strength aspirin to treat cancer. If the United States just keeps doing what it has been doing, future historians will compare American strategy to illusions that British, German, and Russian leaders held as they sleepwalked into 1914. There is no solution for the dramatic resurgence of a 5,000-year-old civilization with 1.4 billion people. It is a condition, a chronic condition that must be managed over a generation. Constructing a strategy proportionate to this challenge will require a multi-year, multi-minded effort. It will be no less ambitious than the 4-year debate that ran from Kennan's long telegram to Nitze's NSC 68 to shape what ultimately became America's Cold War strategy. It will require insights as penetrating as those from the minds of the wise men. In short, it will demand something far beyond anything we have seen since the opening to China. This book hopes to provoke a similar debate today. To that end, this chapter offers a set of principles and strategic options for those seeking to escape Thucydides' trap and avoid World War Roman III. Begin with structural realities. Bismarck exaggerated when he described statecraft as essentially listening for the footsteps of God and then grabbing the hem of his garment as he goes by. But statecraft is more a matter of writing waves of history than making them. The clearer leaders are about underlying trend lines, the more successful they can be in shaping the arc of the possible. In Washington, the first question officials ask about an issue is, what to do? But don't just stand there. Do something is a political reflex, not a strategic injunction. Strategy insists that diagnosis precedes prescription. You would object if a surgeon prepared to roll you into the operating room right after first discussing your symptoms. Likewise, despite exigencies of recurring crises and political pressure to appear decisive, no president should take seriously the recommendations of policy advisors who have not first demonstrated a deep understanding of the challenge at hand. When Nixon and Kissinger began exploring an opening to China, no one imagined that in their lifetime it could create an economy as large and powerful as that of the United States. Their focus was America's Soviet adversary and their purpose, to widen the emerging Sino-Soviet split in the communist bloc. And it worked. But as he approached the end of his life and reflected on the course of events, Nixon confided to his friend and former speechwriter William Safire, "We may have created a Frankenstein. What a monster it may become." In the 3.5 decades since Ronald Reagan became president, by the best measurement of economic performance, China has soared from 10% the size of the U.S. to 60% in 2007, 100% in 2014, and 115% today. If the current trend continues, China's economy will be a full 50% larger than that of the U.S. by 2023. By 2040 it could be nearly 3 times as large. That would mean a China with triple America's resources to use in influencing outcomes in international relations. Such gross economic, political, and military advantages would create a globe beyond anything American policymakers can now imagine. American conceptions of international order begin with U.S. military primacy. But why does Washington have the predominant military force in the world today? Because over the past 3 decades it has invested several times more than all competitors on defense. The 2016 U.S. defense budget exceeds the combined defense budgets of China, Russia, Japan, and Germany. Why has the United States been able to hold the pen in writing the rules of the post-World War Roman II order? While many Americans would like to flatter themselves that it was because of their intelligence, virtue, or charm, the hard fact is that the nation's overwhelming weight has been the decisive factor. Dramatic shifts in the global economy are making this American-led world order increasingly difficult to maintain. In the years since the financial crisis of 2008 and the global recession, leaders in every nation have insisted that their highest priority was economic growth. Yet the rate of growth has collapsed in major economies the world over. U.S. growth has stagnated, averaging barely 2%. The EU economies have fared worse, with total GDP remaining below its pre-recession level until 2016. Only one major economy has delivered. Though its growth rate has fallen since the 2008 economic crisis, China has continued growing at an average of more than 7% annually. As a result, 40% of all the growth in the world since 2007 has occurred in just one country. When comparing the power of two competitors, what matters most is not absolute, but relative growth. How much faster you grow than I do. By this growth gap, China's performance is even more impressive. Since the financial crisis, this gap between China and the US has actually widened from an average of 6% faster than the US in the decade prior to 2007 to over 7% in the years since. The cardinal challenge in statecraft, it has been said, is to recognize a change in the international environment, so likely to undermine national security that it must be resisted no matter what form the threat takes or how ostensibly legitimate it appears. Is a China bigger and more powerful than the US such a challenge? Is military primacy essential for ensuring America's vital national interests? Can the US thrive in a world in which China writes the rules? A world in which China reshapes the international order? As we recognize new structural realities, we must be willing not only to ask, but also to answer radical and decidedly uncomfortable questions. Applied history. Applied history is an emerging discipline that attempts to illuminate current predicaments and choices by analyzing historical precedents and analogs. Mainstream historians begin with an event or era and attempt to provide an account of what happened and why. Applied historians begin with a current choice or predicament and analyze the historical record to provide perspective, stimulate imagination, find clues about what is likely to happen, suggest possible interventions, and assess probable consequences. In this sense, applied history is derivative, dependent on mainstream history in much the same way that engineering depends on physics or medicine on biochemistry. In our Applied History Manifesto, my colleague Niall Ferguson and I have proposed that the White House establish a Council of Historical Advisors, analogous to the Council of Economic Advisors. Its first assignment would be to answer three key questions about the rise of China. The first, what is the U.S. China competition like? In the capital of the United States of Amnesia, everything is declared to be unprecedented. But applied historians ask, have we ever seen anything like this before? If so, what happened in earlier episodes? What insights or clues can we draw from these cases for dealing with the issue at hand? These historians would of course caution busy policymakers against facile analogizing. That temptation to find a fascinating precedent, for example, the rise of Germany, conclude that the rise of China is just like that, and move directly to apply a prescription is itself a trap. As my late colleague Ernest May never tired of saying, the differences matter at least as much as the similarities. While the 21st century does pose unique problems, and this book argues that the size, speed, and scale of China's rise is unprecedented in important respects, all of them have useful analogs, not least the examples in the Thucydides Trap case file. As the most influential modern practitioner of applied history, Henry Kissinger, has cautioned, history is not, of course, a cookbook offering pre-tested recipes. It can illuminate the consequences of actions in comparable situations, but each generation must discover for itself what situations are in fact comparable. The second question our White House counsel should answer is, how did we arrive at what we now call the China Challenge? What we see today is a snapshot. What about the movie that brought us to this point? Locating the current rivalry in a longer perspective can help uncover the complexity of the issue. It also reminds us that even when the problem has been solved, underlying issues may remain for years to come. Reviewing the sequence of scenes that brought us to this point will help policymakers resist the American tendency to focus on what they see today, let bygones be bygones, and look solely to the future, seeking an immediate answer to the question, what to do? Third, how do foreign stakeholders perceive the same evolution of events? As the eminent historian Michael Howard has noted, all we believe about the present depends on what we believe about the past. Not only is it incumbent upon policymakers to understand the relevant history of the issue at hand before acting, they must also try to grasp how their foreign counterparts understand that history. Recognize that America's post-Cold War China strategy is fundamentally a contradiction. While the pivot to Asia was one of the Obama administration's most heralded foreign policy initiatives, in reality it was largely a rhetorical repackaging of the strategy that America has followed toward China under both Republicans and Democrats since the end of the Cold War. This strategy is known as engage, but hedge. 9. Its fundamental flaw is that it permits everything and prohibits nothing. Bureaucratically, this doctrine has allowed each government department to follow its natural inclinations. On the one hand, the Departments of State and Treasury engage eagerly welcoming China as a member of the alphabet soup of international agreements and institutions, from trade, finance, and technology transfer to education and climate. Occasionally, they have called China out for unfair practices, but their overwhelming priority remains building the relationship. So U.S. officials usually overlook persistent Chinese cheating or accede to Beijing's demands for concessionary terms as a developing country. On the other hand, the Department of Defense and Intelligence community hedge. They strive to maintain military superiority, strengthen defense ties to key allies and friends, specifically Japan, South Korea, and India, develop intelligence assets, and plan for conflict with an adversary whose name, like Voldemort's, they are not allowed to speak, but against whom they develop specific weapon systems and operational war plans. In essence, this strategy envisages a China that follows in the footsteps of Germany and Japan. Like these nations, China is expected to accept its place in the American-led international rule-based order. When pressed to explain their theory, proponents argue that as China becomes wealthier, it will acquire a greater stake in the international system that has allowed it to do so, and thus will in time become a responsible stakeholder. Furthermore, as China's citizens become wealthier, they will demand greater say in governing themselves, paving the way for democratic reforms of the sort we have seen in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. During the 1970s and 1980s, when the defining challenge for U.S. policymakers was to defeat the Soviet Union, there was a certain logic to strengthening China by supporting its economic growth and even helping build up its military and intelligence capabilities. But when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, American strategists should have heeded Kissinger's cardinal challenge and asked how fundamental changes in the international environment could undermine vital American interests. 11 Instead, most engaged in a victory lap of triumphalism and forgetfulness, declarations of a new unipolar era, and proclamations of the end of history, in which all nations would embrace the American script and take their places as market-based democracies in the U.S.-designed international order, captured imaginations. On this canvas, communist China was but an afterthought. Assessing America's engage but hedge strategy, Lee Kuan Yew identified two fatal flaws. First, China is not about to become a democracy. As he put it bluntly, if it were to do so, it would collapse. Second, comparing China to Germany and Japan misses the fact that the latter two were first defeated in a hot war, occupied by American troops, and governed for a period thereafter by American high commanders who even wrote their constitutions. In contrast, in Lee's words, China will insist on being accepted as China, not as an honorary member of the West. Review all the strategic options, even the ugly ones. A strategy in this case, engage, but hedge could only survive over the course of 3 administrations, Democratic and Republican, if it had roots in both politics and bureaucracy. No one can doubt that engaging China has had huge benefits for American corporations that have employed lower-cost Chinese workers to produce goods, and for American consumers who bought them. Hedging against such a big adversary has allowed the Pentagon to justify a $600 billion annual budget and the major weapon systems to which the military services are wedded. The question is whether there are significantly different strategic alternatives that might be feasible and preferable to the current one. In the hope of stimulating the imagination of readers, national security officials, and others in the strategic community who bear responsibility for U.S. policy toward China, this chapter concludes with brief sketches of 4 potential strategic options. These stretch from accommodation, essentially drawing pointers from British policy toward the United States during the 20th century, to regime change or even splintering of the country, as Britain might have done in dealing with the U.S. had it assisted the Confederacy in the Civil War, and as some believe the U.S. was doing in encouraging Ukraine to move into the embrace of the West. Most of these strategic options may seem impolite or impolitic to consider. Taken together, they suggest a wider range of opportunities for the United States to address an ascendant China. Accommodate. Accommodation is not a bad word. Opponents seek to conflate it with appeasement. But the two are not synonyms in the realm of strategy. Accommodation is a serious effort to adapt to a new balance of power by adjusting relations with a serious competitor, in effect, making the best of unfavorable trends without resorting to military means. Accommodation comes in 2 varieties, ad hoc and negotiated. British policy toward the U.S. in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, after the government concluded that it had to avoid war at virtually any price, provides an example of ad hoc accommodation. It shows how this can be done gracefully with a clear sense of priorities and in a way that helps the emerging superpower appreciate overlapping interests. As we saw in Chapter 9, Britain's choice of forbearance toward the United States was a key factor in avoiding war. Over territorial disputes in Venezuela, for example, Britain ultimately agreed to the U.S. demand that the British accept arbitration under the Monroe Doctrine. Similarly, Britain exempted the United States from the two-power standard, which committed the UK to maintain naval forces equal to those of the next two largest competitors combined. The Yalta Agreement, in which Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin drew the borders of post-war Europe, illustrates the possibilities and pitfalls of a negotiated accommodation. At the Yalta Conference of 1945, the United States, Britain, and Soviet Union essentially accepted the military facts on the ground. Anticipating public criticism that they had conceded too much to the Soviets, Churchill and Roosevelt persuaded Stalin to accept the Declaration of Liberated Europe, a statement committing the great powers to allow free elections and democratic governance in Eastern European states in return for acceptance of Russia's 1941 borders and the Moscow-organized Lublin government in Poland. But when a dictator who had never allowed elections in his own country predictably violated that agreement, Roosevelt was accused of betrayal. If it were exploring accommodation, could the United States agree, for example, to curtail its commitment to Taiwan in exchange for Chinese concessions in the South and East China Seas? Could the U.S. and China come to an understanding over the future of the Korean Peninsula in which the U.S. would withdraw troops from South Korea in exchange for Chinese denuclearization of the North and recognition of a united peninsula under Seoul's authority? Could the U.S. recognize a de facto Chinese sphere of influence around its borders? Undermine. A strategy to foment regime change within the country, or even divide it against itself, would require leaders in Washington to stretch imaginations further. If the U.S. were to attempt to undermine its rising rival, what means might it employ? Could it openly call into question the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party the way Ronald Reagan bluntly called the Soviet Union the evil empire in 1983? This might not be as extreme as it sounds. As Kevin Rudd has pointed out, Chinese leaders have long believed Washington will never really accept the legitimacy of the CCP. So why pretend otherwise? And if American leaders go so far as to declare their fundamental opposition to the Chinese government, why not go a step further and attempt to do something about it? Clearly, communism has been exposed as a fraud in every country where it has been tried. Why should a small group that still calls itself communist rule 1.4 billion fellow citizens? Are Chinese citizens less deserving of the human rights America's Declaration of Independence declares to be the God-given endowment of all people? If democracy is the best form of government for all nations, why not for China? We already know that the Chinese people are adept at democratic governance. 23 million who fled. Mao have built a successful democracy in Taiwan with a market-based economy that, were it an independent nation, would rank in the top third among UN member states. The United States supported the right of the Scots to hold a free ballot on declaring independence from the United Kingdom, as well as the Kosovars when they separated from Serbia. As a strand in a strategy to divide China and demoralize the regime in Beijing, why not likewise support independence for Tibet and Taiwan? China would undoubtedly react violently to such initiatives. But ruling out this option ignores America's long record of backing independence movements, even over the objections of adversaries, and forfeits leverage. China now has the world's largest number of internet users. Smartphones allow Chinese to see within government limits the world beyond their borders, as do tourism and the emerging elite's education abroad. When given a choice, Chinese citizens exercise their freedom to go to whichever website they choose, buy what they want, and travel at will. Washington could leverage this nascent preference for political freedom. During the Cold War, the U.S. waged an overt and covert campaign to undermine the legitimacy of the Soviet government and its ideological foundation. Policymakers today could take many pages from that playbook in mounting an effort to bring about regime change in China. For example, the U.S. government could use its cyber capabilities to steal and then leak through third parties inside China damaging truths about past and present abuses, revealing, for example, how its current leaders became wealthy. The U.S. could cultivate and encourage dissident groups in China, as it did in Soviet-occupied Europe or the Soviet Union itself during the Cold War. Chinese studying in the U.S. are naturally infected with concepts of freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. They could be encouraged to agitate for political change when they return to China. In an extreme option, U.S. forces could covertly train and support separatist insurgents. Fissures in the Chinese state already exist. Tibet is essentially occupied territory. Xinjiang, a traditionally Islamic region in western China, already harbors an active Uyghur separatist movement, responsible for waging a low-level insurgency against Beijing. And Taiwanese who watch Beijing's heavy-handedness in Hong Kong hardly require encouragement to oppose reunification with this increasingly authoritarian government. Could U.S. support for these separatists draw Beijing into conflicts with radical Islamist groups throughout Central Asia and the Middle East? If so, could these become quagmires, mirroring the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan where U.S.-supported Mujahideen freedom fighters bled the Soviet Union? A subtle, but concentrated effort to accentuate the contradictions at the core of Chinese communist ideology and the party's attempts to exert authoritarian control over citizens' increasing demands for freedom could, over time, undermine the regime and encourage independence movements in Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. By splintering China at home and keeping Beijing embroiled in maintaining domestic stability, the U.S. could avert, or at least substantially delay, China's challenge to American dominance. Negotiate a long peace if it were negotiable. The U.S. and China could agree to take a quarter-century hiatus that imposes considerable constraints in some areas of their competition, leaving both parties free to pursue advantage elsewhere. From the 30 years peace that Pericles signed with the Spartans in 445 BC to the U.S.-Soviet détente in the 1970s, rivals throughout history have found ways to accept intolerable, but temporarily unchangeable circumstances in order to focus on more urgent priorities, particularly their own domestic affairs. Nixon and Kissinger's readiness to negotiate an array of agreements that produced what the U.S. and Soviet governments termed détente reflected their sense that the U.S. needed breathing space to repair divisions at home driven by the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. Among these arrangements were SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, which froze the rivals' buildup of the deadliest nuclear-armed missiles, the ABM Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which obliged each competitor to forego defenses against the opponent's missiles and thus acquiesce to a position that left its society vulnerable to destruction by the other, and the Helsinki Accords, which legalized the division of Europe. As Kissinger has explained, a crucial element of détente was linkage. The United States conditioned its concessions on issues of importance to the Soviet Union, such as recognizing East Germany, on Moscow's restraint on issues Washington considered significant, including access to West Berlin and tolerance of American escalation of the bombing campaign in Vietnam. The political costs of these agreements were substantial. Analysts still remain divided over their merits. Some celebrate them for establishing a new international order in which both Moscow and Washington gave up their ambitions to overthrow each other's regime. Others, however, see the arrangements primarily as having bought time to demonstrate which of the societies and systems of government was superior. Proponents of the latter view who joined the Reagan administration in 1981 saw no contradiction between negotiating further agreements with Soviet leaders, while simultaneously seeking to undermine the evil empire's regime. In the current stage of the Chinese-American rivalry, both governments face overwhelming demands at home. Given China's view that progress advances in decades and centuries rather than days and months, it has historically shown a capacity to set problems aside for long periods, as it did in reaching the Shanghai Communique in 1972, which effectively set aside the issue of Taiwan, or in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping proposed to Japan that disputes over islands in the East China Sea be shelved for a generation. Americans tend to be less patient. Yet the menu of potential agreements is long and fruitful. A pact to freeze disputes in the South and East China Seas, to affirm freedom of navigation for all ships in all international waters, to limit cyber attacks to agreed domains and exclude others, for instance, critical infrastructure, or to forbid specific forms of interference in each other's domestic politics. As was the case during Cold War détente, the U.S. and China could link issues to reach agreements that give each more of what it values most. For example, the United States could agree to moderate its criticism of China's human rights violations by ending publication of the State Department's annual Human Rights Report on China and high-level meetings with the Dalai Lama in exchange for constraints on China's practice of espionage for economic gain. If Beijing were prepared to remove anti-ship and anti-air missiles from its islands in the South China Sea, Washington could limit surveillance operations along China's borders, especially near China's military installations on Hainan Island, as the country's leaders have long demanded. China could agree to end regular patrols near the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea in return for the U.S. stopping provocative freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. The U.S. could propose that China freeze island building in the South China Sea, accept limits on the modernization of its submarine fleet and anti-satellite weapons, and reduce its amphibious warfare capabilities in exchange for the U.S. slowing or even stopping development of a conventional prompt global strike capability, delaying deployment or removing advanced missile defense systems in South Korea and Japan, and recognizing Chinese sovereignty over the Paracel Islands. The United States could limit or even end arms sales to Taiwan and withdraw some forces from South Korea if China forces Pyongyang to end further tests of nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. Redefine the relationship. In 2012, Xi Jinping proposed to President Obama that they jointly invent a new form of great power relations, in which the U.S. and China would respect one another's core interests. For Xi, core interests meant respecting each other's de facto sphere of influence, which in his view includes not only Taiwan and Tibet, but also China's claims in the South China Sea. Unwilling to accept these terms, the Obama administration rejected this formulation, and President Trump has been equally unsympathetic. However, the U.S. could propose its own conception of a new form of great power relations. In the final years of the Cold War, during a private walk with only Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev and their translators present, Reagan began with a question: if planet Earth were invaded by hostile Martians, how would the Soviet Union and the United States respond? Initially, the Russian interpreter misunderstood Reagan and his translation raised eyebrows. Was Reagan telling Gorbachev that Martians had just invaded Earth? After the confusion was cleared up, Reagan pursued the question. His purpose was to underline the core interests that otherwise deadly adversaries shared. If we follow Reagan's lead, do the U.S. and China today face threats analogous to an alien invasion challenges so severe that both sides are compelled to work together? One does not have to stretch too far to answer affirmatively. 4 megathreats loom above all: nuclear Armageddon, nuclear anarchy, global terrorism, especially as threatened by Islamic jihadism, and climate change. In confronting each of these, the vital national interests the two powers share are much greater than those that divide them. Because of the inescapable logic of mutual assured destruction, if the US and China were to stumble into a war in which their full nuclear arsenals were launched, both nations would be erased from the map. Thus their most vital interest is to avoid such a war. Moreover, they must find combinations of compromise and constraint that avoid repeated games of chicken that could inadvertently lead to this dreaded outcome. Nuclear anarchy poses a distinct megathreat of its own. A world in which many states have acquired large nuclear arsenals would be a world in which some conflicts go nuclear and some nuclear weapons find their way into terrorist hands. A nuclear war between India and Pakistan could kill hundreds of millions and wreak global environmental havoc. North Korea's sale of a nuclear weapon to the next mutation of Al-Qaeda or Xinjiang terrorists, and the explosion of that device in New York City or Beijing would fundamentally change our world. President Kennedy identified this threat in 1963, forecasting that by the 1970s there would be 25 or 30 nuclear weapon states. Understanding what that would mean for America's survival and well-being, he set in motion a number of initiatives centered around the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Together, these efforts bent this arc of history. Today there are not 25 or 30, but just 9 nations with nuclear weapons. Thanks to the cooperation of China, as well as Russia, negotiations succeeded in shelving Iran's nuclear aspirations for a decade or more. Nonetheless, the buildup of nuclear weapons and material, particularly in North Korea and Pakistan, is substantially increasing the risk of nuclear terrorism. No states are better positioned to address these challenges than China and the U.S., especially if they act in concert and can persuade Russia to join them. Resolving proliferation threats by North Korea and Pakistan will diminish the danger of not only nuclear terrorism, but also state-level proliferation in countries like South Korea and Japan. But if they fail to do so, we should expect to see a nuclear bomb explode in a city like Mumbai, Jakarta, Los Angeles, or Shanghai at some point in our lifetimes. Other types of megaterrorism pose lesser, but still extraordinary threats to the US and China. The driving technological development of the second half of the 20th century was the integration of engineering and physics that produced everything from the computer chip and the internet to the nuclear bomb. Its analog in the 21st century is the integration of engineering with genomics and synthetic biology, which has given us not only miracle drugs that target specific cancers, but also biological weapons that could be used by a single rogue scientist to kill hundreds of thousands of people. Nature itself offered a preview of this danger in the SARS epidemic of 23 and the Ebola plague in Africa in 2014. Now picture a terrorist in a biotech lab creating an antibiotic-resistant smallpox pathogen and releasing it in an airport in Kunming or Chicago. This danger cannot be met by either nation acting alone. Extensive cooperation through bilateral intelligence sharing, multilateral organizations such as Interpol, and the establishment of global standards will be essential. The fourth horseman of this prospective apocalypse is the continual emission of greenhouse gases to the point that the global climate becomes incompatible with normal human existence. Scientists have warned that when greenhouse gases reach 450 parts per million, we are likely to see a 30 Fahrenheit increase in global average temperatures, causing catastrophic impacts. Acting alone, there is nothing the U.S. and China can do inside their own borders to meet this slow-motion disaster. Although China and the United States are the two leading carbon emitters, if either were to reduce its carbon emissions to zero while all other nations continued on their present course, the effect on global climate would merely be postponed for several years. Presidents Xi and Obama recognized this fact in forging the U.S. China agreement that led to the 2016 Paris Agreement, which commits states to cap carbon emissions by 2030 and begin reducing them thereafter. And while the world has celebrated this accord, and rightly so, two harsh realities stand out. First, with current technologies, achieving those targets is impossible. Second, even if all nations fulfill their pledges, global warming will get worse, albeit at a slower rate than if we did nothing. As the two largest economies in the world, the U.S. and China have a special responsibility and the leverage to lead the community of nations out of this existential crisis. These four challenges may seem daunting, perhaps even insurmountable. But fortunately, an array of win-win opportunities are available to demonstrate the benefits of cooperation and motivate the U.S. and China to step up to the larger threats. Global trade and investment have unquestionably produced a larger pie with bigger pieces for both nations. How that pie is divided between them, among other countries, and within their own societies is another matter about which debate is intensifying. Support for economic integration is no longer a given, particularly as more and more people believe globalization has left them behind, fueling a surge of populism, nationalism, and xenophobia. Despite their many differences, the U.S. and China have a common interest in managing these rising forces and ensuring that they do not unravel the fabric of the global economy. More elusive, but unquestionably real, is an emerging global consciousness among the planet's most active golden billion inhabitants. To a degree unseen in history, they have come to share perceptions, norms, and practices. Ubiquitous communication networks have shrunk the globe, allowing elites everywhere to be aware of almost everything, and almost instantly. Smartphones bring images and words from every corner of the earth. Explosions, hurricanes, and discoveries anywhere impact consciousness everywhere. The experience of international travel, not only by the global elite, but also by average citizens, is now commonplace. Some 800,000 of China's best and brightest go abroad for their education, 300,000 studying in the U.S. Pause to think about the fact that the current president of China and his wife sent their only child to college not at Xi's alma mater of Tsinghua University, but rather at Harvard, where she graduated in 2014. How the views of an emerging generation of internationalists can be reconciled with the more nationalistic or populist inclinations of their fellow citizens is a puzzle. Finding ways in which the internationalists' understanding of the world can be translated into new forms of cooperation remains among the most intriguing opportunities.